is Jessica Katzenstein. I'm a postdoctoral fellow in the Inequality in America initiative at Harvard University. And my research is on the failures of US police reform. I'm a cultural anthropologist, and I conducted 16 months of ethnographic research between 2015 and 2018 with officers in Maryland, as well as some reformers and organizers and other folks. And one of the things that I work on is police training and why it's not the cure-all that we hope it will be.
Well, yes, it's interesting because, a lot is focused on this kind of anti-bias training and de-escalation, but in your experience with the training modules and how police were trained, you found there was a different kind of, something else was being stressed, and maybe you could kind of tell us what you found and how you found it.
Yeah, one of the things that I found in observing police trainings in academies and SWAT trainings is that a lot of these trainings that are supposed to be more reform oriented are meant to teach officers to de-center fear about their own survival, and they're meant to kind of calibrate their fear relative to the realities in front of them, so that they don't perceive when someone is just holding a cell phone, like Stephon Clark in California, they see that it's a cell phone rather than shooting out of fear. So these kinds of trainings that I observed were meant to make officers less violent and reduce specifically anti-Black police violence. And what I found is that they basically replaced one form of violence with another. These trainings sort of aimed to minimize and sometimes successfully did, I think, minimize impulsive decision making by officers. But in doing so, they kind of replaced this reliance on impulse and racialized fear with the idea that officers are these kind of professional, or should be these professional violence experts, who are nonetheless centering their own safety. So that's one of the things that I write about in the article I sent you, that at sort of the core of even these reform-oriented trainings is the idea that officer safety comes first, and that's sort of inescapable. So that's what I found, that one of the things I found, that these trainings that are meant to reduce police reliance on fear for their own survival ended up just reproducing those fears in sort of a different way.
Yeah, one of the things that I found most illuminating in the whole discussion you had was this kind of continuum that you identify in the idea that authority needs to be established and complete so that control can happen, which equals safety, which equals survival. And maybe if you could kind of walk us through how you came to understand that through the training and how that kind of works itself out on the ground.
Yeah, sure. So that gets to, I guess, command presence. So for those who don't know, command presence is the way that officers are trained to embody the authority of the state. They're trained to look professional, they're trained to look well-trained, and they're trained to look authoritative, and they're sort of taught to embody this command presence in a whole variety of ways. The way that they hold their body, the way that they dress, the way that they speak, the kind of tone that they take. And the idea of command presence is that it can be, it's thought of as a bit of a de-escalatory option for some departments that have a use of force continuum. Command presence is often the lowest rung, and with the idea being that if you can sort of forcefully assert your authority in a way that gets people to comply, then you won't have to resort to physical violence or even shouting at someone. If you can show that you are in charge and in control of a situation, then you are potentially, they're trained that means that you can sometimes avoid having to use violence. And in the trainings that I observed, officers were taught that embodying this command presence and doing so effectively was a really key ingredient to protecting their own safety, not just to, avoiding having to commit violence against civilians, but also protecting their own vulnerability. And they were taught that basically embodying the authority of the state is also a way of protecting their own selves. I don't know if that answered that question.
That does, and I think that it kind of goes back to, it was kind of a roundabout way to get back to what you identify as police common sense. And this notion that like safety is the most important thing for the officer. And I guess implicitly the person they're dealing with as well, you want them to be as safe as the officer feels safe. But this notion of safety kind of carries with it some problems, I suppose, in that like it's not necessarily the way we would think like safety town, like making sure you cross the street correctly, that kind of thing. It's a little bit different for police officers, and it's tied into this police common sense. And I guess I'd like you to kind of talk a little bit more about that.
Absolutely. So, I mean, officer safety is it's a broad subject, right? Like it also encompasses, and officers are trained on things like vehicle safety. One of the leading causes of deaths among officers in the line of duty is actually automobile accidents, or things like suicide, which is also a leading cause of death. The kind of officer safety that I focus on in that article, and that reforms focus on generally, training reforms, is officer safety relative to the possibility of civilians attacking officers, right? And so I came up with this to get back to the question. I came up with this concept of police common sense to try to understand this sort of almost like hermetically sealed ideology that I kept running across in officers, but also in reformers, like even folks who, politicians and civilians who are involved in coming up with police training reforms will leave room for the idea of these threats to officer safety, right? And they'll leave room for the idea that on top of all of these reforms around de-escalation, around communication, that officers still have the right to protect their own safety against civilians who might want to hurt them, whether or not that threat actually materializes. And that's an argument that is scaffolded by case law, right? There's case law going back to Graham v. Connor that gives officers legal discretion to commit certain forms of violence if they can reasonably state that or if a reasonable officer present at the scene would have perceived the same kind of threat and taken the same kinds of actions. So police common sense was a way of trying to understand this, the sort of entrenchment of officer safety in the way that police think and the way that reformers think. So by that concept, I'm thinking of it as something that kind of sutures together these mutually contradictory ways of thinking. So for instance, that on the one hand, threat can come from anywhere, anybody can threaten you and as an officer. And then on the other hand, that as we all know, threat is explicitly and implicitly racialized. It's always the Black body that threatens the Black person, the Black man who threatens. So that's kind of how I was thinking about police common sense and the centrality of officer safety to these trainings.
Well, one of the things that came up because I marked this down as a key phrase about police common sense is it naturalizes certain forms of police violence and even renders it inevitable. So I think maybe that's a very powerful statement. And I think if you use it to lead us into scenario training and what you witnessed with some of the VR and stuff like that, I think maybe you could unpack that sentence a little bit and tell us how it kind of works itself out?
Sure. Yeah. So scenario trainings are what I focus on in this paper, and scenario trainings are, what they sound like, right? They're trainings where officers are meant to act out real life scenarios, like making an arrest or shooting someone or not shooting someone, or de-escalation or implicit bias. They're kind of used in a wide range of trainings. They're a modality of training. And they can be in-person role-playing, or they can be virtual reality scenarios. And they're meant to teach officers to sort of calibrate their judgment based on reality, so that they're not making impulsive decisions based on fear, but rather have been given the chance to rehearse how they should respond in a difficult situation. And we see scenarios in all kinds of other trainings in different fields. They're disaster preparedness, pandemic preparedness. So it's not something that's unique to policing. But one of the things I look at is how VR scenarios in particular, they can be used in a wide variety of ways. They can be used to help officers learn to de-escalate. So there are VR trainings where, they're basically, you'll see a screen, images of people, of actors acting out various scenarios, and you kind of have to stand there and respond to them. And there are scenarios where you can, you'll be judged based on how you talk to the person. So it's not all about shooting and not shooting, but that's also a very common type of scenario training. And yeah, so getting back to it, one of the things that I found is that all of those scenarios, no matter how much they were meant to be used for de-escalation or good communication, all of them contained at least the possibility of threat. And that threat doesn't have to be deadly, right? It can be, there were scenarios I observed where the threat was, a dog barking and startling you, or perhaps a dog attacking you, but not necessarily something that is deadly threat. But that there is always some form of threat present in these scenarios, with the idea being that officers need to learn that when they're out on the streets in the real world, that there could always be threat there. And this sort of resonates with, a lot of folks I think are now familiar with the fact that officers in police academies are often shown these videos, these officer safety or officer survival videos, where police are killed for not paying attention in sometimes really incongruous ways. Like they make a traffic stop of an older woman who they think is unthreatening, and then she stabs them with scissors, like the kinds of things that don't necessarily happen regularly by any means, but that are taught to make them, to inculcate constant vigilance. And these VR scenarios lean on that same logic, but what I found is that they materialize threat in ways that recruit officers even more deeply into this idea that their survival has to come first. And one of the examples I gave is this really, slightly bizarre and again incongruous scenario where you have to respond to this call in a parking lot, and there's a little girl there and a woman bleeding on the ground, and you don't know what's happened, and suddenly the little girl turns out to be holding a gun, and she turns it on you, and you have to shoot her. And that's kind of what these VR scenarios do. They both emphasize the idea that threat can come from anywhere, a little girl, an older woman, anybody. And they make it feel real and present in a way that in-person, real-life role-play scenarios can't necessarily do in the same way. And that's meant to be the appeal of these virtual reality trainings, that they put officers into a in some ways more compelling version of reality. But I argue that what that does is that it is drive home the idea that violence will always be required. Not necessarily that in every scenario you will have to be violent, but that in every scenario there is a potentially profound threat to your life that you have to be prepared for. Well,
right. And it seems to be that it just undermines the entire purpose of the training too, in some regard, because if it's centralizing threat, and the way you say it in the article somewhere is you have to think threat first. So don't think reasonably, think where tactically, right? That idea of like who could be behind that car, who could be behind this car, and that kind of, I kind of want to get into eventually the constant vigilance and how it affects Black citizens, especially the marking and indexing. And maybe if you could talk a little bit about, just a little bit about how that, some of the training was meant to kind of move away from that, correct? But it seems like we're not moving as far away from it as we should be if this is.
Right. Yeah. Well, and I think that speaks to one of the broader issues with these kinds of reforms and with a lot of reforms in general, that they normatively attempt to address issues like the fundamental anti-Blackness of US policing, but they end up reinscribing that in ways that they may not have expected. And yeah, some of these trainings are explicitly colorblind. These VR trainings, for instance, I was really struck by the fact that the majority of the aggressors in those trainings were not Black. In fact, they were mostly white. And presumably that is at least, I don't know, but presumably I assume that is at least partly an attempt to sidestep accusations of anti-Black racism. But, one of the difficulties here, and one of the reasons that I have come out incredibly pessimistic about the possibility of these reforms affecting any kind of substantive change, is that they can't take individual departments away from the, again, foundational anti-Blackness of policing. You can't train officers out of something that a form of racism that isn't just individual, right? It's not just personal bias. It's not just implicit bias. It's the entire way that policing is structured. It's the fact that no matter what you teach officers in the academy, many will go out and work in and be called to majority Black, majority poor neighborhoods. And that is how we have set up policing. So, yeah.
Yeah, and that over-policing of communities can be a very difficult thing for people to get their heads around, but it is something that is a form of systemic racism. And I know you didn't talk about it in your paper, but it is kind of what we're talking about, right? This kind of over-policing of poorer neighborhoods, and then that creates a whole system of unfair or disproportionate enforcement, right? Yeah, absolutely. And this is why I mentioned the way that command presence, for instance, ties into the marking of Khalil Gibran Muhammad's the condemnation of Blackness, the ideological marking of Blackness as criminality, and the idea that Black folks are the and have historically been the targets par excellence, to for lack of a better word, of American policing. And the thing that kind of goes hand in hand with the what I would call colorblind racism of the system is also this hyper masculinity. I know you use the term heteromasculinity, but could you kind of talk about, because there's a quote in the article about a supervisor talking about threat and really dehumanizing the person that you're engaging with. And to me, that just kind of undermined, that kind of said everything there was to say about it. Because, I guess I could read it. It says, be aware, but relax. There's a difference between being nervous and being aware. If you're nervous, shitbags are going to see it. And that just, I know that they're talking about potential threats, someone who's a bad actor, but, it speaks to that heteromasculinity, that hyper aggressiveness, that command presence we were talking maybe you could kind of unpack that for us a little bit and how that ties into all this.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and shitbag was just one of many terms of art that some of the officers I worked with used to describe the people they encountered, and of course, that is very clearly racially coded. It was used, unsurprisingly, mostly to refer to young Black men. And yeah, this gets to how toxic heteromasculinity and white supremacy are, and anti-Blackness are tied together. And command presence is just one of the spaces where one could talk about this and make that connection. And they fit together insofar as officers are taught, command presence is a very heteromasculine way of being. Like, you're supposed to be large and in charge. You're supposed to be commanding, dominating. And so I mentioned in the article that, women, for instance, had a particularly difficult time learning to embody that heteromasculine habitus, that heteromasculine way of being. And they were taught that that is how they survive. That is how they are able to dominate civilians. And that domination is itself profoundly racialized. And so these systems work together in ways that, scholars of, Black studies, carceral studies, American studies, scholars have talked about this have talked about this in a historical and systemic and structural context, the ways that these forms of domination and oppression feed off of each other. And one of the things I talk about is how that manifests at the more individual level of officers learning about command presence in these trainings.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think so besides virtual reality training and kind of that, what else did you encounter that kind of played into this? Any other scenario training, or was it just kind of in person and virtual reality?
As in other spaces where I saw scenario training specifically?
Yeah.
One other one that I don't talk about. So mostly, yes, they were either in-person role-playing or less commonly virtual reality. And that comes out in all different forms of police training. And in fact, among the departments that I worked with, scenario training was kind of considered the gold standard relative to classroom training, sort of more static, like lecture-based training. In academies, in police training academies, recruits would start in the classroom, and then scenarios were kind of where they went to really learn like on the job how to be cops. And I'm certainly not the first to remark that police in general tend to particularly value practical experience-based knowledge. And that's something that scenarios are meant to inculcate. And aside from SWAT trainings and academy trainings, so one other major space where I saw scenario trainings, mostly in person, was in mass shooting, active shooter trainings. And that's something that one can see, of course, outside police departments too, the active shooter trainings that police and, federal programs put on for churches and synagogues and schools. And, this is something that is a gold standard for training outside policing as well.
Yeah, that's interesting because it's and how often, well, I guess not how often, what is the requirement for police training? I mean, is there a national standard? Is there so many hours to get certified? Is there a certification? Or is this kind of a voluntary by department basis?
Yeah, so my understanding is my familiarity is mostly with Maryland. I do know that there has been a national survey from the Institute of Criminal Justice Reform, which found that the average required police training is around 20 weeks, so slightly less than 6 months. But that really varies widely by state. And I think in at least one state, there is no basic training requirement. States basically set the minimum standards for academy training. Maryland, I believe it's 6 months or 20 weeks, somewhere in there. individual departments can require more training than that, and there are some that do, but they can't require less. And then beyond academy training, there's in-service training, which is like the yearly recertification that officers have to undergo, and that too, the minimum standards are determined by the state. So like everything else in this country, right? It's a patchwork that depends on the state. And just one more thing to note, there are some states, actually many states, where officers can work in law enforcement, or at least in certain capacities, for a predefined length of time before they have even undergone basic training. And in some cases, including Maryland, it can be up to 12 months, depending on what position you're working in.
Well, and before we wrap up, I think we'd be remiss to kind of address the immediate question that I think people would have hearing this about this is, well, how dangerous is the job? Most people think of policing as highly dangerous, and that they are walking into threat-based environments every time they get out of their car. And is that what the research bears out? Is that what we've seen, or is the reality different?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yes, on the one hand, statistically speaking, policing is more dangerous than many occupations. It's more dangerous than going to work in an office, but it doesn't even make, if I remember correctly, it doesn't even make the top 10 most dangerous professions in the US. There's logging, fishing, like all kinds of truck driving, professions where rates of fatalities and injuries are significantly higher than policing. Jordan Blair Woods, if I remember correctly, did a study on how often officers actually face danger in traffic stops, routine traffic stops, which police are often told is sort of one of the most dangerous things you can do is pull someone over because you don't know what you're getting into. The car is a dangerous place. Being on the side of the highway, of course, is dangerous. The study found some incredibly tiny number of fatalities relative to the number of traffic stops that officers conduct every day in this country. So policing is certainly not dangerous, but it is nowhere near as dangerous as portrayed. And one of the things that officers are taught is that, yes, at least, the officers I've worked with, is that, you will not be encountering actual danger on a daily basis, and you should not be jumpy, and you should not be nervous, and you should, and that's where command presence comes in. But at the same time, you never know when it will hit you, right? You never know when there will be a mass shooting. You never know when someone will jump out of their car with a gun. You never know when that little girl will pull out a gun and kill you. So it's that the routine danger narrative, I think is what Woods calls it, that really structures how police and how many people who are not police think about the threat that officers face. And it's not entirely true.
So going forward, what would you say is the prognosis for U.S. policing, and how would you fix training? And maybe you don't have an answer to that, but I always try to end with some sort of final conclusion of.
Yeah, I think my response is bleak. My research really made me into, I think, a profound cynic about the possibilities of police reforms. I will say that the thing I always come back to is Ruth Wilson Gilmore's distinction between reformist reforms and non-reformist reforms. And the latter, non-reformist reforms, are those that do not give more power or money or legitimacy to policing. So basically harm reduction. I think if maybe there are certain kinds of trainings where one could make the argument that they are a form of harm reduction, that they are not bringing in more funding to police departments, but they're doing something that makes police less likely to commit immediate harm. Those kinds of reforms, I think, can be worth fighting for. But very often the kinds of training reforms that are proposed and that actually gain any traction are ones that are amenable to police departments' desires, right, which is to increase their legitimacy, increase their funding, gain more power, gain more ability to do what they perceive as their jobs. So my entire argument has become about has become a case against most forms of police reform policies and proposals. So my suggestion is always, or my advocacy is, the thing I advocate for is always do not invest in trainings that further the power or the legitimacy of police. Do not believe that these trainings will accomplish the ends that they're meant to accomplish. If they were going to, they already would have. So I guess that's kind of the pessimistic note I would end on, which I think is frankly more than warranted by the history of policing in this country and by what I saw.